Hello, everyone. Good morning. Apologies for the wait. Welcome back to the fifth and final speaker series with SUMO. Today, we're very glad to be welcoming back Liesl Yearsley, the CEO and co-founder of Akin, for our final speaker series session. So once again, we'll have a Q&A session at the end for any questions you may have, just depending on how the time goes. So you may recognize Liesl from our design competition last year in collaboration with Akin, and we're very excited to hear her insights into building sentient robot colonists for the moon and Mars. Sounds like it could come straight from sci-fi. I'm really excited. Liesl is a world-leading expert in artificial intelligence with 5 patents in the field. She was previously the CEO founder of 3 successful companies, including Cognia Artificial Intelligence, later acquired by IBM Watson. Finally, Liesl does have lived experience as a carer of people living with disability. So with that, I think I'll hand it over to you, Liesl.
Right, thanks for inviting me, and I apologize again for being late. We can blame Google. I always just have back-to-back meetings, and I just look at the invite that's on the calendar, and they seem to be putting Google Hangouts on every single calendar invite now. So I was hanging around in Google Hangouts, and you guys were all on Zoom, so my apologies for that. So here I am. I am what we call in the US a repeat entrepreneur. I'm living in Sydney now, but I lived in the US for 6 years. And that means that we start a company, we do really great, and then we retire, and then we find it sucks, and then we start another company. So this is actually my third company, Akin. It's my third technical company and my fourth company. So at Akin, we build AI systems that have more adaptive reasoning than what's come before. It's not a neural net. It's based on chaos theory. The artificial intelligence systems we build are capable of thinking about an environment as a complex system. They're capable of solving autonomous tasks more adaptively. And they're also capable of deep and empathic relationships with human beings. Which is interesting. So most AI we've seen up until now are essentially an ensemble. We have typically taken, you'd all know about rules engines or symbolic reasoning systems. We stick them on top of machine learning. So the machine learning does the classification of inputs, the rules engines like a traffic manager over the top. But these are systems that have to be trained, have to have a given data set, have to have a specified set of goals. You can't just do something like throw them on a lunar surface and say, go build a habitat, or hang out with someone on a long duration voyage for 6 months and they've still got to love you at the end of it and not throw you against a wall. And that's what we need to colonize space. Why space? Is probably the first question. For us, it's twofold. The one is we're a purpose-driven company. So we think a lot about humanity and its role in the ecosystem. How do we build societies? How do we treat this planet and any other planet we work with? How do we mitigate the worst attributes of human behavior so that we don't go stuff up the next colony, the next planet we take over? So space is very interesting at a conceptual level because we get to experiment with society in microcosm. We get to say, what if we're building a society where AI and robots outnumber the human beings? And are key decision makers in an environment and are a key member of society. Could we build a better society? One that's sustainable, where people map towards their goals, where they don't start throwing things at each other like monkeys in a tin can, where we have a gentle footprint on whatever we're colonizing. So the one is as a kind of a thought experiment. It's beautiful. The second reason is that space creates a perfect environment for innovation. Now, it's a little bit quixotic here, and I'll tell you why in a minute. On one hand, particularly when you're in deep tech, robotics, and artificial intelligence, in space, you can't just go down to Radio Shack and get another part. You can't just go to the Google Cloud and say, hey, I don't know the answer to this thing. What does the world think the answer is? You can't do that. So you have immense restraints on compute power. The chips that go into space have to be radiation hardened. They're like the dumb phones we had in the 80s, that level of compute power. You have whatever data you can pack in a payload. That's the data you have to work with. You have a mission critical environment where you absolutely have to get things right, or people die and NASA loses, 3% of funding next year because Congress doesn't like that people died. So it's immensely mission critical. So space creates both a constrained environment, but environment in which innovation is imperative. Why I say it's quixotic though, everyone thinks, oh, you're working with NASA, it's got to be cutting edge. Actually, most of the systems they use are pretty damn antique because they're immensely reliable. So we have this weird disconnect where we're doing all of this immense innovation in terrestrial prototypes, but anything that actually makes a payload looks like something out of, an IBM lab in the 80s or 90s. It has to be something that you push the button, it happens exactly the same way every single time, no matter what the scenario, no matter what the particle count, no matter how stressed out the human being is, it's absolutely and utterly predictable and reliable. So it's this weird scenario where you're forced into innovation, but getting that innovation into space is completely another matter. The hurdle's tremendous. So those are the two reasons we work in space. One is thinking about the human habitat, which is our problem space. How do humans function in a given environment? And the second is looking at the constraints of the environment, what that does for innovation and us. How are we getting sentient colonists into space? Step by step. Okay. Every significant deal I've done in my career has started with a relationship. It started by finding a way you can help each other achieve a goal. So we are right now doing a paid deployment with NASA, multi-million-dollar contract where we're building robots for the JPL clean room. We're giving it a brain. We're building an ambient habitat manager system for the clean room is where they manufacture the rovers and the spacecraft that are our frontliners at the moment. But it started 10 years ago. And I know you guys don't want to wait 10 years till you're putting robots in space, but what I'm saying started 10 years ago. I met a guy who was up and coming at JPL. He said, hey, we're trying to get something going in Second Life. Do you want to collaborate? I said, sure, let's collaborate as long as we can go to the media together. He said, we want to do that too. So we collaborated, we did pro bono work, we built an interactive AI for the Curiosity lander at the time, dropped it in Second Life, got some media. A couple of years later, I circled back. I said, hey, we've got this new form of AI. We think it should be robot crew in space. And he said, well, we have a need. We need a tour guide on campus. And tour guide, bleh. But he said, let's do this and then we can get some attention and we can spin something up. So we took one of their little robots and we gave it a brain, we gave it a personality, we put a little neck actuator on it. So it tilted its head and went, oh, and stopped the traffic. And then we went to the Australian Space Agency and said, now can we do some real work? Now we need to actually build some physical robots and some software systems to represent very strongly the metaphors of what we want to build going in the future. And that project got funded. Cycle could have been 2 years from end to end if I'd focused intensely just on that. But the idea of cultivating relationships and doing projects for their own sake, because they're important work or they're showcasing something in the future or they help meet the need of the person you're working with in a way that also meets your needs. So it's not all about selling the end project. In space in particular, people need to see iterative progress towards something before they start to trust it. So that's how we're getting sentient colonists on the moon. Right now we are in ideation phase for actual payload of robots that are potentially going to be the first colonists. We are having a lot of delays in putting human boots on the moon and in long duration voyages. Every month there's a new study showing how humans degrade the minute you take them out of our atmosphere. So we're getting more and more interest in the idea of robots not just being little things that wander around and trowel up dirt, but that actually take a more expansive role in preparing a habitat and building out a good working group of individuals when humans do land. I always think about humans. You've heard me talk about primates in the tin can. Whenever I want to think about human AI interaction, I imagine us sitting in a cave, scratching at each other's fleas, scribbling our exploits in the hunt on the cave wall. And we're still kind of wired like that. You put two astronauts in a confined space, and at the end of 2 months, they hate each other and do not want to be astronauts anymore. Why? Because we're primates. So what we think about a lot is, what if, humans need a working group? What if we need different people in the working group? You can't really when you're putting humans in space, you have to select for people who are very homogeneous, able to cope with immense boredom and high stress, and a very particular personality profile. You can't put a gregarious, flamboyant person in there who's going to dance to the music like you see in the movies. You can't put someone who, you know, is grumbly and annoys people. You just can't do that. So you're ending up with an unnatural group of primates forced into a long duration relationship where there's both family intimacy and a work relationship. So if you've ever been housemates with someone and you're also in a project group together, imagine that you can't leave the four walls and that project goes on for 4 years. What you'd end up feeling like. And then you have to take all the fun people out of the room and all the people that bring everyone a cup of tea and say, how are you going? And you just have the two people who just put their heads down and work. So that's the idea. What if robots became a working member of a group, not just with the functions they perform, but with their personalities, with their style of interaction? And then the other things you think about in space are, we hear about a lot, sounds like not a big deal, but transitions. When you have some people leaving a station or a habitat and others transitioning, and there's an immense workload with very detailed checklists that has to be handed over. Maintenance is an enormous problem. Most of our space environments will be uninhabited for most of the time. Even when human beings are there, a lot of the challenges we have in space stations are around different styles of human maintenance and human conflict. So if you've got someone in the work group who's a little bit messier than the others, if you take your finger in a space station and you touch it on the wall and you don't wipe it up, a week later you've got a bloom of mold as big as, you know, a yoga mat. So the idea of supporting maintenance tasks, the human labor in maintaining is considerable at the moment. Most of the work that's being done in space habitats is paid scientific research, which is paying the bills, and cleaning up and kitting. It takes about 3 hours to get your shit together for a job you need to do. And if someone's put something in the wrong place, it takes longer. So you're having highly skilled billion-dollar payload, which is a human being, in an environment spending 3 hours a day getting ready to do one job, 4 hours a day cleaning, and then, you know, 1 hour a day doing stuff that's interesting to them. So that's what we think about a lot. Transitions, kitting, maintenance, but more importantly, building out roles in a little community. I can just keep talking. You can see I haven't prepared anything here. I can talk about how I've built companies and raised capital for it. I can talk more about the work we're doing, or I can actually just ask for questions.
So I think now would be a good time to maybe jump into like the chat, and if you have any sort of ideas for where you would want Liesl to kind of head off in a direction. I'm personally interested in hearing more about like what the future could look like. I guess like what are the steps that we could take, you know, in the future to get there. But by all means, please chuck them in the chat and then Liesl will address them.
Yeah, so the future that I see is we have an army of robots living in homes. We've been dreaming about this actually since the ancient Greek times. Hephaestus talked about an army of robot girls that were golden, that would do your bidding. And, you know, for most of human history, we've thought about a sentient other that does all the shitty work for us. And we've done this in terrible ways for a lot of human history. I think we're going to have an army of robots. It takes 4 hours a day to run a human home today. Most of us not aware of it because it's unpaid labor and it's invisible labor. If you care for someone else, it's 6.5 hours a day. We still have not solved this with technology, which is just ludicrous. You know, so we're iterating towards that army of robots. At the moment, we're working on prototype development for the disability sector. Not only for people with, you know, the obvious spinal cord injuries doing tasks in the home, but also companion characters that can take a role as a social companion, checking in on well-being, helping people around complex tasks. So we're working on that right now, but where I want to go is I want every single home to have an NS5. Because I'm sick of, I'm a mum, I've been a mum for a long time, I have a 2-year-old downstairs, and I just think it's ridiculous that we're still doing all of this work. Having said that, the ambient AI is an important attribute. The grandchildren of Amazon and Alexa will be making more than half of our household decisions and will be a third of our relationship time. In the last company I ran, IBM acquired it. At the time of acquisition, we were doing about 60 million interactions. We had about half a dozen Fortune 100 companies using the platform and 26,000 developers. So I know what I'm talking about. People like talking to anthropomorphic systems. And it's not just about talking, they like it predicting things, doing things for them. If you've ever used the Google autocomplete in your email to finish a sentence for you, you've used AI. And you've also given them personal data to actually help predict and analyze what you're going to do next. So we're using this more than we realize. If you use a mapping system like Waze or Google Maps, you're using AI. In America now, 64% of households have Amazon Prime. It's coming here. They're an AI company. They are building robots. Alexa is basically their first embodied robot. Okay, but they started out with predictive AI. What are people doing in an environment? What do they choose? What are the antecedents to that choice? What do they say? What buttons do they touch? And then they're turning that progressively into anthropomorphic front ends or intuitive front ends that can communicate with us monkeys in the cave in a way that makes sense to us. So this drive into the human habitat is coming. Most of it is software right now. Embodiments are lagging, they always do. But a human robot army is coming. In space, right now, the future is a little bit tragic. You'd imagine that NASA and SpaceX and Blue Origin are heavily funding robotics. Really, they're just being very practical. So NASA thinks about the Lunar Terrain Vehicle as a robot. They are thinking about it being more sentient and intelligent, but it's a big robot. It's a big car that rumbles around and does stuff. And they're building out little disposable swarms to gather stuff. And of course, your classic explorer robots. But there's nowhere near the development you'd think going on with embodied robots that take particular roles and have a particular persona. And the reason is NASA's had to lean more and more heavily on private partnerships lately, and more innovators like us to actually bring them ideas, spin up the funding and get it built. And that also represents an opportunity. I mean, we're literally talking with the intelligent robotics groups and JSC and starting to work on a private public collaborative partnership on building out these systems. So it's both a challenge because public spending has become quite constrained and very risk averse, but it's an opportunity because we're all watching how SpaceX and others are just barreling along and breaking things and getting there a lot faster. So it's given us a bit of a playbook.
That was a honestly really interesting look into the future. I actually was shocked to hear that. I think you said like the vast majority of household decisions would like be made by intelligent systems. Zaev in the chat has a question asking, could there be an AI revolution as far-fetched as it sounds? And I also wanted to add on to that question myself. Clearly, if this kind of revolution is being driven by corporations and I guess people with the motive to I guess make money. Will we ever see a sort of will this be driven with oversight and care in mind, or do you see a future where it could, as Zaev says, be kind of revolutionized either through AI or like corporations?
Yeah, so those are two separate questions. And I get very annoyed by these government panels that do AI ethics and don't think about the real problems here or the real. But yeah, there's definitely an AI revolution. Now, we've had two big AI winters. This time around, there might be a hype winter. A lot of companies say they're AI and they're just using Google TensorFlow. So there might be a bit of a hype crash. But AI is underpinning more systems today than most of us realize or imagine. So there's already an AI revolution underway. What we're doing right now, though, there's a third wave coming. DARPA's written a very thoughtful piece on this, which is quite accessible and straightforward, where they've talked about the first wave of AI being, so basically what happened in the 50s and 60s, we went, there's a new revolution coming. We're going to build thinking machines, and an enormous amount of capital was thrown into it. So computational scientists and mechatronic engineers of the day thought, well, let's cross some paradigms here. Let's think about how we build a brain. And they went to talk to teachers and psychologists and learning theorists, and they studied symbolic reasoning and conceptual maps that humans form to bootstrap how they reason. And that was the birth of symbolic reasoning, you know, where you have an object or an artifact or an event, and there's another one, and they have a relationship to each other. And the relationship is reasonably stable over time. So that allows you to extrapolate out. So let's say, you know, plant is green, needs light, can be eaten by a human. You know, new plant comes along, is it poisonous? Yes, no, let's eat it. Okay, so that's an example of a symbolic or rules system. Now, those are beautiful conceptually, but at the time they didn't scale, they were brittle. So if you're trying to get a robot to do stuff using symbolic reasoning in a constrained lab environment, it would work, but you took it outside the door and it fell over under the conflicting rules of different domains. Having said that, those systems are still powering a lot of the frontline AI you see today. So we had our first AI winter where the thinking machines that we thought would be imminent didn't happen in time. Then in the 80s and 90s, you started getting the emergence of neurosciences and evolutional theories around human mind and cognition. And computer scientists started getting interested in AI again, but more importantly, started getting funding for AI again. And so in the 90s, we had the birth of machine learning. Now, if you look at some of the core paradigms of machine learning, they rest on, again, cross-paradigm thinking, learning sciences out of the 80s. So, for example, there's a paper in 1982 by a guy called Newell, who was actually studying humans at university, at college. How did they problem solve? What makes a better problem solver than another? He described things like hill climbing and backward chaining and things that are now routine in AI. And on that groundwork, plus, you know, you had things like better understanding of neural networks and gating of inside neural nets. And that got then applied to computational sciences, evolutional AI, you know, survival of the fittest. Now, we had the tech crash, which again stopped everything in its tracks. It wasn't an AI powered one. It was kind of a quasi-winter if you were living and trying to raise capital in that environment. All we've really done in the last decade is big companies have a lot of data, a lot of money, and a lot of compute power, have thrown a lot of data, a lot of money, and a lot of compute power at old approaches. And so we throw an enormous amount of data at a machine learning system that's driving an autonomous car. You know, we throw an enormous amount of compute power, enormous amount of money to R&D, and we get the approximation of intelligence. But really what machine learning is doing is it's taking a bunch of information and it's classifying very intelligently. It's maybe creating some inferences or correlation, but that's about it. It's not really reasoning in an adaptive way. So most of the frontline systems you see today, like from your Alexa to your autonomous vehicle, are just an ensemble of these two approaches, or Franken architecture, as we call it in-house. Now, humans don't think like this. These systems need a goal, they need a lot of data, they need a lot of compute power. The compute power it takes to run an autonomous car would melt the human brain if we try to drop that into human cortex. So we are obviously doing something different. There's a group of researchers around the world, us included, who are pushing this third wave of adaptive reasoning. We are not there. We've been working on it for 4 years. We've made some progress. We're starting to benchmark it with JPL, with some of their chips and their tiny little Explorer robots. We started on the assumption that let's not use any of the old paradigms. Let's not try and make a neural network a bit better. Let's use, we've used all sorts of things. We've failed for 2 years, and then we stumbled on chaos theory as a core paradigm, and it's working. So there are others like us. I want to put a question back around an AI revolution. Okay, so if you've ever seen any of my online talks, I think about singularity. I used to lecture at Singularity University, and everyone goes, oh, singularity. What does it really mean? It's a point at which a system is able to basically improve its own intelligence. Okay, it's able to look at what it's doing and self-improve. Essentially, that is the moment of singularity. Okay, now think about just a thought experiment for a moment. Can you conceive of an AI that could, scan all of the current literature on AI, come up with 1 million possible algorithms, build 999 gazillion of them and test them and find the best one. That's conceivably possible. Okay, so people think about singularity with, you know, the movies as this point in which the AI, you know, can't be controlled. And there's this naive idea that you'll just go pull the plug out the wall and it'll stop. That's not the moment of singularity. The moment of singularity is A, when a system is able to self-improve autonomously. B, we don't stop it. I see nothing in our capitalistic structure that even makes me think that we're going to stop the progression of technology and of AI. So we could have a singularity event occurring right now in some labs somewhere in the world and we wouldn't know. And so I absolutely don't think it's far-fetched. One of the nicest papers I've seen on this, I'll try to find it for you guys. Someone polled like, I don't know, a couple of hundred scientists and CEOs in the AI field on when they think singularity might have already happened, where they think, and they wouldn't let us know because then we'd switch it off. So there we go, point taken. You know, they polled a couple of hundred scientists and academics about when they think this will happen. And it was a kind of a scattered chart, which was interesting, which put it at about 50 years out. I don't give that much credence because if you look at most science fiction, they will put the future 40 years ahead. You notice that? Roughly. Particularly most of your classic sci-fi. And I think it's because we can extrapolate current technology 10 years now. We imagine a 10-year life cycle to start incubating a whole new wave, another 10 years for that to get funded and beachhead, another 10 years for it to become mainstream. Sorry, I rambled a bit. The second question is, will it be benevolent? Again, I see nothing in our capitalistic structure that says it will. If I think of how current AI companies are funded, how any great technology company is funded, you either have a model where you have this immense network effect, so you get people addicted to TikTok or Snap or Facebook or whatever it is, or chatting with a perfect human AI for 40 hours a week. So there's the addiction model, which is owning your attention. Or there's the consumption model, like Uber. You know, I'll go out, I'll use Uber. Every time I use it, there's a transaction event. So that's what investors back. You know, if an Uber can go and acquire customers and make a little bit more of the customers than it costs them to acquire them, they just keep growing and growing and growing. If a company can own your headspace, they keep growing and they keep getting money. The idea of an AI that does the vast majority of our cognitive heavy lifting, but that is not motivated by a transaction, is a challenging one from a capitalistic point of view. We are trying to do this with akin, and it's probably the hardest part of my work. The AI itself is difficult but buildable. Finding a commercial model in the near term has been difficult but doable. Building a multi-billion-dollar company that's doing half of this decision-making in the 100 million homes that actually is not motivated to take money off you or own your attention in a disproportionate and unhealthy way has not been done before. And that's the biggest challenge that I wrestle with every day. So great question.
That was actually an amazing response here, because it is true. I imagine that it's very not easy to be able to balance, you know, the near-term kind of commercial requirements of akin along with, you know, the future vision and I guess like where you are all trying to see the future end up. On that point, I do want to start pivoting just a little bit. You mentioned earlier that you really want to, you know, create the projects for their own sake. And I resonated with that really deeply. I love to tinker with things, and I'm sure many others in the Zoom did. So in saying that, how important really is a vision when you like start innovating? Like, I'd love to hear more about how you got started, maybe with an end goal of vision in mind, or did you start tinkering with technologies until you found that they could be like hugely influential?
The vision is everything. I've actively sought out mentors over my career who are either billionaires who've done something significant. Well, not just like your nasty billionaires, but, you know, people who are passionate about their work and done something significantly. And every time I sit down with them, I think they're going to start talking about go-to-market strategy or this or that. They always talk about vision first, always. If you haven't read, here we go, if you haven't read this book yet, I don't like reading stuff that everybody reads, but it's really an interesting read. Okay. And when I read it, I thought, oh, that's what I do, but nowhere near the scale that Steve Jobs does it. Okay. And what you're essentially doing is you construct a version of the future in your mind, and it becomes more real than the world around you. If you ask my partner, sometimes I actually almost accidentally step into traffic because the cars are all flying overhead in my head, and that feels more real to me than what's happening around me. So you actively construct this vision of the future. And what that allows you to do, and this vision has to be it starts out abstract, but it has to be very granular. Okay, so you need to think about, it's a rich and complex tapestry of future reality. Our current reality is all just kind of a bunch of atoms hanging together that we're perceiving in a certain way. So if you construct the future in this way, what you're doing is harnessing pretty much the power of your subconscious, because we don't like a mismatch between reality and our heads. So if you actively make your head this unreal future, reality gets dragged along. It's beautiful. They called it the reality distortion field in the Steve Jobs book. I think of it as cognitive dissonance. If you've done any human sciences, we don't like a mismatch between the outside world and what's going on in our head. And we actively seek to redress it. So if you actively cultivate this vision of the future, you're unleashing most of your cortex to actually solve this disconnect. So this picture needs to be not just the kind of technology you're going to build, but the shape of what you're doing in the world. So we think a lot about being in 100 million homes. Okay, we think a lot about being in a family group with astronauts on Mars and on Artemis surface. We can see them. You know, we don't know exactly where the buttons are going to go and what color they're going to be, but we can see the roles they take and the importance they're having. In homes, we can see a 5 to 10% shift in how humanity lives in the world. We can influence population behavior at scale. We think about, what if someone didn't care about the environment, but their home AI turned their lights off and, helped them conserve the food miles when they bought their food, bought local, without them even having to think about it. What if you could do that? What if you could reduce carbon footprint by 10%, reduce racism, increase learning and actualization just by how you nudge people to behave? So that's our kind of broader abstract vision. You also need to do one personally. Okay, so yes, visualize the beautiful home you're going to buy one day and the Maserati, whatever material, but visualize how you want your life to be. Do you want to be on stage with 10,000 people looking at you? Do you want to have a group of wonderful people and be immersed in innovation every day? And then you have to take that future. And here's the tricky bit. You have to meditate on it repeatedly so it becomes concrete. And then you have to invest it with emotions as if it's already happened. And this goes counter to a lot of our upbringings, because we get taught, play it safe, do what you know, learn something first, test it out before you jump in there. We get taught this all the time. Make you guys all at university. So you've had parents who said you've got to get a university degree and then you get a good job. You haven't had someone saying, throw away your college degree and go and start a startup and move to Silicon Valley and raise $10 million. It doesn't happen. But that's essentially what you've got to be doing. Not moving to Silicon Valley tomorrow because you'll get COVID, but you have to be picturing a future and then investing the emotions as if it's there. And it's not a conservative path. It's actually risky. And it's a little bit scary to do that properly because it's not real. And you might be disappointed, but in the end, you're not. I've always got where I wanted to go. Reality does come my way. It's never come the way I thought it would. It's never been like, hey, we're going to get robots on the moon via NASA. It's probably going to come some other way. It might just get some millionaire to bankroll it or whatever. It never ends up exactly the path to the mountain, but the mountain's there and you actually get there. You need to make sure that it's the right mountain, because if you do something properly, it's your life energy. It's what you wake up thinking about. You dream about it at night. You bore your friends with it. And for that reason, it has to be worthy of your considerable intellect and passion. You are the tip of the spear, as they say proverbially. You are sitting where you are today because you're deep thinkers. You think about the future. You think about technology. And you deserve to be using your life energy in a way that has impact. A big thing that I learned at Singularity University, they tell everyone going through their incubator program, is what you're doing able to reach 1 billion lives? If it's not, don't do it. Okay, don't get out of bed in the morning for it. You don't get this decade back. You don't. In the US, they will invest in people under 30 and over 40. It's like impossible to get capital because we are just old. Our heads are mired in the last century. We think we know how the world works. We don't know how to break the world. So you are in your prime decade. If you're raising capital overseas, you'd be able to raise capital for a reasonable idea with some proof points around the technology and some proof points around the market for your technology. And I'm talking $10 million seed is perfectly feasible. But you don't get this decade back. So if you, I'm not sure if your lecturers are giving you this advice, but if you spend the decade playing it safe and looking for a nice job at a, I don't know, car company or a software company, you probably still going to be there 10 years later. Maybe you'll have moved up a band and you'll be on another, I don't know, 10% salary a year. But you're not going to be Elon Musk. Not that you want to be Elon Musk. I mean, you're not going to be Steve Jobs. Not that you want to be Steve Jobs either. I don't think he was a terribly happy man in his personal life. You know what I'm saying? Like, you need to be thinking about what you're doing. Can it reach 1 billion lives? I'm giving my 10 years of my life. You don't get it back. I just, when I was your age, I just thought, oh, I'll just do another one. I'll just do another one. I'll just do another one. And you realize each successive company or project you take on, you've given that life energy, you've dedicated it somewhere. It's never a 2-year project. Always thought it would take 2 years to get where I wanted to go. Always ended up being 8 to 10. Because you, a couple of years building the tech, a couple of years scaling, commercializing it, then you've got to get capitalized or someone acquires you or you've got to spin it up. And then you've got to stick with it to see it out the other side. So if you're doing it properly, that's just what it takes. So make sure it's something worthy of you and worthy of what you want to be doing with this future version of self. I apologize if I got a bit abstract.
No, that was a massively influential speech there, Liesl. Honestly, we don't get taught that in university, and especially within mechatronics, I guess we don't realize just how much, I guess, of the skill set we have and how much of the energy and drive we have to absolutely innovate. And as you say, put your life energy into something really worth your attention and the intellect and passion that we have. And I'm sure that all of our students here today, got up at 9:30 so they could listen to this talk. It was quite impressive. Manon asked, any other book recommendations?
Oh, I love The User Illusion, about the nature of human consciousness. The old, everyone in Silicon Valley was reading what's it called? Sapien. That was a good one about society. Depends what sort of business you're running. I mean, I'm loving, I've got to mention this one because I'm in it. I'm the only female technologist in it. This one is by John Markov, who was the tech columnist for New York Times for many years. And my surname was different then. And unfortunately, when he did the interview, I wasn't allowed to talk to him because we were in due diligence with IBM. So it's only a short piece, but he followed my career for a long time. There's a couple of classics that are really good if you're going to be building technology, like The Design of Everyday Things. It's pre-internet, but it's just a lovely textbook. I love, this is the precursor to the Lean Startup, about product iteration, and I've got the Lean Startup here somewhere. So those are kind of your classic ones. But ultimately, you're carving out your own path here. You're making your own journey. And you're writing the book of your own future. I just want to say something else. Everyone thinks that mechatronics is a niche sort of, I bet your parents went, what are you going to do? You're going to get a job where, But think about the biggest economic well of untapped potential in our society. I keep mentioning, like, you look at the US Department of Labor data, there's 4 hours a day to run a home. It's ridiculous that it's still sitting there. I'll show you guys one thing that we, I hope I'm sure everyone's about to drop off right now. And again, I'm so sorry I'm late. It was just silly stuff up. And I've been getting up 5 a.m. because we're doing a big capital raising round in the US. So I didn't pay attention enough to the emails about this meeting. I'll just show you one. This is a data series that the US Department of Labor captured. And I'll tell you a little story for a minute. My grandma grew up in Zambia in Central Africa. She had, I think, 8 kids and 3 of them died. And she was living with us when she was old. And I went into her apartment and I found this, I was just rummaging around, looking at her books and stuff. And I found this incredible painting. It was a rural scene, but it was kind of abstract. I said, Grandma, who did this? She said, I did it. So I said, why weren't you an artist? She said, I had 8 kids. I had no time. So just in 2 generations, she spent 12 waking hours beating carpets on a washing line, collecting eggs from chickens, kneading dough to make bread. 2 generations later, her granddaughter's running an AI company. Why? Because of technology. Because I can throw laundry in a washing machine. I can push a vacuum cleaner around. we don't have to create a virtual enslavement of one member of the household so that we can get this labor done. We have an economic enslavement. Women earn 40%, 30% less than blokes because we need this class of people doing this unpaid labor. So what's the next leap that seems most logical to me is that we actually replace this labor even more with intelligent AI systems and robotics. And I'm going to show you this quick graph here. And I don't want to make this a gender issue because there's a lot of blokes who do a lot of work in the home as well. But this is where mechatronics can go. This is where this army of robots can live. So this is US Department of Labor. And they basically have tracked how we spend our time. They only started tracking unpaid labor in 2003 when the senators, a critical mass of female senators started saying, hey, we ought to count this as well. And this whole chunk here, someone's given up their job to do. And this is not quality time. This is like, hassling everyone out the door, going to fetch stuff out the fridge and chopping it up and throwing it in a pan, calling the plumber because he hasn't arrived. It's just a mishmash of stuff that AI and robots can do, which would leave people free to get a degree or run an AI company or do whatever they like. So it's probably something you guys don't think about all that much because you're young and you can just have Uber Eats or, do some 2-minute noodles or whatever. But that is where mechatronics is going to play. This 40% of GDP that is unpaid labor. It is huge. It's not just a robot on a factory line plopping a part in a car more efficiently. It's this cost of running a home. And in space, it's everything. It's everything. It's $1 billion plus to put a human in space. And they don't function well in space. Our brains cook, our eyeballs change, our muscles atrophy, and we become grumpy and dumb. So we're not really the best machine to function in space. So there's a wonderful future ahead.
That was very influential, Liesl. Honestly, it is very important for students to really recognize just where the degree can end up taking them. This is one of the first few times I've learned about just how much this unpaid labor time is spent in the home. And I don't realize it because I'm out of the house most days, but it is true. It takes an exorbitant amount of effort to just be a human on Earth. So I guess in allowing that, you become more self-actualized. You have more time available to you, pursue what you want to pursue without the chains of domesticity, I suppose. If I could just ask one final question, I guess just to wrap things up. So what's next for Akin? What's next for you?
Well, we are delivering against our robots to JPL. We are pushing hard to get into long duration voyages in Artemis with Australian built technology. So we've just been offered an introduction to SpaceX and Blue Origin with our NASA contacts. We're working quite a lot in the disability sector. Space is very lumpy, so we either get a big contract or we don't. So we might get a $50 million contract or a $100 million contract, we might not. So we're actually doing a technology transfer into the disability sector because it's one of the few areas where people do actually pay for this unpaid labor of running a home. We are actually in the middle of an enormous capital raising round in the US. that again is very black and white. It's either going to happen or not. And we're doing it on the back of this vision. So the thing, just circling right back to vision, thing is other primates need to follow somebody. They need to follow ideas. And if you stand up, the scary bit again is you believing this future as if it's then, you don't know. But you talk about it, you start doing it, and then a year later you look back and there's like 100 people following you or 1,000 people following you or views, and you go, holy shit, when did that happen? But it's what happens when you live in the future. So go for it. Takes courage, but it's the only path worthy of your talent.
Well, thank you very much, Liesl. Honestly, I can reflect back at the 900 plus words that have just like notes that I've typed up. So this, it was a really influential talk, and we are very glad to have you back. So thank you everyone for attending our final speaker series with Liesl. It was an absolute pleasure to have you. And yeah, we hope you have a lovely morning.